My daughter-in-law slid a stack of nursing home admission papers across my kitchen table and smiled as if she were doing me a favor. "Maxine, it's time," Vanessa said. "You shouldn't be living on your own anymore." I looked at my son Ethan, waiting for him to laugh, to defend me, to say this was ridiculous. Instead, he lowered his eyes. At that moment, the house my late husband and I had built no longer felt like home. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I quietly stood up, walked to my bedroom, locked the door, and made a phone call. 10 minutes later, everyone in that house wished they had never started that conversation. If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you trusted, let me know in the comments. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Your stories mean more than you know. If family drama stories like this speak to you, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep sharing this journey together. My name is Maxine Price, and at 68 years old, I thought I understood the difference between strangers who could hurt you and family who never would. I was wrong. Before I tell you how my daughter-in-law tried to send me to a nursing home, you need to understand how everything began. For nearly 40 years, I lived in the same house in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't worth millions of dollars, but every inch of it carried memories. My late husband Robert and I bought the property when we were newly married. Back then, it was little more than an empty lot and a dream. I still remember standing beside him in the mud after a spring rain, looking over the unfinished foundation. "One day," he told me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders, "our grandchildren will run through this yard." At the time, we barely had enough money to buy groceries, but Robert was a man who believed in building things slowly. He built our house, he built our family, and for many years, he built a life that made me feel safe. When Robert passed away from a heart condition 8 years ago, part of me died with him. People tell you grief gets easier. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it simply changes shape. For months after his funeral, I would wake up expecting to hear his footsteps in the hallway. I would make 2 cups of coffee by accident. I would reach for the phone to tell him something funny before remembering he was gone. The only thing that kept me moving forward was my son Ethan. Ethan was my pride and joy. As a child, he was thoughtful and kind. He opened doors for people, helped elderly neighbors carry groceries, called me every Sunday even after he left for college. When Robert died, Ethan became my rock. At least that's what I believed. Then he married Vanessa. The truth is, I liked Vanessa at first. Everyone did. She was charming, beautiful, confident. The kind of woman who could walk into a room and instantly make people feel comfortable. The first Christmas after she joined our family, she spent hours helping me decorate the house. She called me Mom from the very beginning. Not Maxine. Not Mrs. Price. Mom. I remember how touched I felt. One evening, she sat beside me in the kitchen and said, "I hope someday Chloe and I can be as close to you as Ethan is." I nearly cried. I thought I had gained a daughter. Looking back now, I wonder how much of it was real. A year after their wedding, Ethan and Vanessa began experiencing financial difficulties. Nothing dramatic at first, just normal problems, a medical bill, a car repair, an unexpected expense. Like most parents, I helped when I could. I loaned them money for repairs. I helped cover Chloe's school expenses. I paid for a family vacation after Ethan lost a bonus at work. Every time they promised to pay me back. Most of the time they didn't. I never complained. I told myself that's what family does. Then things got bigger. A few years later, Ethan and Vanessa wanted to buy a house. They were short on the down payment. I wrote them a check. A large one. The kind of check that makes your hands shake before you sign it. Vanessa hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You have no idea what this means to us," she said. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. After all, what mother doesn't want to help her child build a better life? Over time, though, I started noticing small things, tiny details, questions that seemed innocent. At first, Vanessa would ask about Robert. Did Robert leave life insurance? Was the mortgage paid off? Did you ever update your will? The questions didn't seem unusual. Many families discuss those things. Still, something about the frequency bothered me. Months would pass, and another question would appear, casually, almost accidentally. Who inherits the house someday? Do you have a trust? Have you thought about estate planning? I usually laughed and changed the subject, but Vanessa always circled back eventually, like someone checking whether a door had finally been left unlocked. One afternoon, she was helping me organize old files in my study. I stepped into the kitchen to make tea. When I returned, I found her holding a folder labeled property documents. She quickly put it down. "Oh, I was just trying to help." I smiled, but something felt strange. A tiny warning bell rang somewhere deep inside me. I ignored it. That's the thing about trust. Once you give it to someone, you often explain away the things that should concern you. Years passed. Life continued. Birthdays, Thanksgivings, graduations, family dinners. Everything looked normal from the outside. But there were moments I couldn't quite forget. Like the time Vanessa asked whether my homeowner's insurance included replacement value. Or the days she wanted to know exactly how much property tax I paid each year. Or the afternoon she casually asked whether Robert's name was still on any bank accounts. Each question alone seemed harmless. Together they formed a pattern I didn't fully understand yet. Then came the conversation that changed everything. It happened about 6 months before the nursing home papers appeared. We were sitting on my back porch drinking iced tea. The sun was setting. The air smelled like freshly cut grass. Vanessa stared out at the yard. "You know," she said, "this property has probably gone up a lot in value." I shrugged. "I suppose." She nodded thoughtfully. "If you ever decided to sell, you'd make a fortune." I laughed. "Why would I sell?" Her smile flickered for just a second. Just 1 second. But I saw it. The disappointment. The calculation. Then it disappeared. "Oh, I don't know. Just thinking out loud." That night, for the first time, I lay awake wondering whether I truly knew my daughter-in-law. Not long after that, more questions started appearing. More conversations about aging, about safety, about planning for the future. And although I didn't realize it then, Vanessa had already started building a story she wanted everyone around me to believe. A story where I was becoming confused, forgetful, unable to manage on my own. At the time, I thought those comments were harmless. I had no idea she was laying the foundation for something much bigger, something that would eventually threaten everything Robert and I had spent a lifetime building. And by the time I finally understood what Vanessa was doing, she had already taken the first steps toward convincing everyone else that I was the problem, including my own son. The first time someone suggested I might be losing my memory, I laughed. The second time, I became uncomfortable. By the third time, I started paying attention. It began with little comments from Vanessa, the kind of comments that sounded caring on the surface, dangerous underneath. One Sunday afternoon, she stopped by while I was watering flowers in the front yard. A neighbor named Susan was walking her dog across the street. Vanessa smiled and said loudly enough for Susan to hear, "Mom, did you remember to take your afternoon medication today?" I blinked. Afternoon medication. She gave a soft laugh. The blood pressure pills. I take those in the morning. For a split second, something flashed across her face. Then she recovered immediately. Oh, right. I forgot. Susan smiled politely and continued walking. The conversation lasted maybe 20 seconds, but it stayed with me, not because of what Vanessa said, because of how she said it, as though she wanted someone else to hear. A week later, it happened again. We were having lunch together. Vanessa casually looked around the restaurant and asked, "Mom, did you drive here by yourself?" I raised an eyebrow. "Of course." She leaned forward. "I just worry because you've seemed forgetful lately." I nearly laughed. Forgetful, I balanced my own checkbook, managed my own finances, paid every bill on time, maintained my property, scheduled my appointments. What exactly had I forgotten? When I asked her that question, she simply smiled. "Oh, probably nothing important." Nothing important. The phrase bothered me for days. Soon I noticed the pattern. Vanessa never directly accused me of anything. She planted suggestions, tiny seeds, comments here, questions there, little concerns wrapped in kindness, the kind that made people think. Maybe Maxine really is slowing down. Maybe she does need help. Maybe Vanessa is just worried. The worst part was how believable it sounded. After all, I was 68. People expect older women to become forgetful. They expect us to need help. Sometimes they start treating us differently long before we actually need it. 3 months later, something happened that truly frightened me. A bank statement never arrived. I always received my statements during the first week of the month. This one never came. I assumed the mail was delayed. Then another document failed to appear. Then another. Finally, I called the bank. The representative confirmed everything had been mailed. I thanked her and hung up. The next day, I searched through my mailbox carefully. Nothing. That evening, Vanessa stopped by unexpectedly. While she was helping clear dishes after dinner, I mentioned the missing mail. Her response came too quickly. "Oh, maybe you misplaced it." I stared at her. "I've never misplaced my bank statements." She shrugged. "It happens." Maybe, but I knew it hadn't happened. Not this time. A few days later, I found one of the missing envelopes inside a kitchen drawer I never used. The envelope had already been opened. I stood there holding it, my heart pounding. Someone had opened my mail. Someone had moved it. Someone wanted me to think I had forgotten where I put it. I immediately thought of Vanessa. Then I hated myself for thinking it. Accusing family felt ugly, paranoid, wrong. So I said nothing. I wish now that I hadn't ignored my instincts, because things continued getting worse. Around that same time, my prescriptions became confusing. For years, I kept a simple routine: morning medications in one organizer, evening medications in another. Never a problem. Then one morning, I noticed several pills missing. I checked the container, counted again. Still wrong. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I had accidentally taken an extra dose. But the same thing happened the following week. Then again, one afternoon I called my pharmacy. The pharmacist reviewed my records. Nothing unusual, no changes, no errors. Yet somehow my medications weren't matching the schedule. That night I checked my pill organizer carefully before bed. The next morning, 2 compartments had been rearranged. I froze. Someone had touched them. I lived alone. Only a handful of people entered my house regularly, and Vanessa was one of them. Still, I had no proof. Only suspicion. and suspicion can destroy families. So once again, I stayed silent. The situation escalated when neighbors started asking strange questions. One morning, Susan approached me while I was trimming rose bushes. She looked hesitant, almost embarrassed. "Maxine, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She lowered her voice. "Are you moving into assisted living?" I nearly dropped my gardening shears. "What?" Her eyes widened. "Oh." Immediately I knew. She hadn't expected that reaction. "Who told you that?" I asked. Susan hesitated, then reluctantly answered. "Vanessa mentioned that your family was exploring options." My stomach tightened. Exploring options. No one had discussed assisted living with me. No one. Yet somehow people were already hearing about it. I smiled politely and changed the subject, but inside, alarm bells were screaming. That evening, I called Ethan. "Have you and Vanessa been talking about me moving?" Silence. "Not long. Just long enough." "Mom, nobody's decided anything." The words hit me harder than if he had shouted. Nobody's decided anything. That wasn't a denial. That was confirmation. I gripped the phone tighter. "Ethan, what exactly is being discussed?" "Vanessa just worries about you." "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." "I know." His answer sounded uncertain, like a man repeating something he wanted to believe. When we ended the call, I sat alone in my living room staring at Robert's photograph above the fireplace. Something was happening, something deliberate. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether Ethan was part of it. The thought broke my heart. For weeks afterward, I paid closer attention. I started documenting everything: dates, comments, missing mail, odd conversations, questions, patterns. The former secretary in me couldn't ignore details, and the details were becoming impossible to dismiss. Then another strange incident occurred. One afternoon, I received a reminder call from my doctor's office. The receptionist mentioned a conversation about cognitive screening. I frowned. "What cognitive screening?" She paused. "The one requested by your family." "My family requested that." "That's what the notes indicate." I felt cold. Very cold. I canceled the appointment immediately. Then I sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour, thinking. Someone was building a case. Not a legal case. A personal one. A narrative. A story. A story where Maxine Price was becoming forgetful, confused, unable to manage her affairs. A story repeated often enough that people might eventually believe it. Even my own son. And if enough people believed it, what came next? Guardianship control of my finances. Selling my home. At the time, I couldn't answer those questions. But deep down, I knew one thing. This wasn't about concern anymore. This was preparation. Preparation for something much bigger. And although I still didn't understand the full plan, I was beginning to realize that Vanessa had been laying the groundwork for a very long time. What I didn't know yet was that someone else in the family had already noticed what was happening. Someone much closer to Vanessa than I was, someone who was becoming increasingly frightened. My granddaughter Chloe. And soon she would risk everything to warn me. After the strange comments, the missing mail, and the questions about assisted living, I hoped things might settle down. Instead, they accelerated. About 3 weeks after my conversation with Ethan, Vanessa invited me to dinner at their house. The invitation sounded innocent enough. "Mom, Chloe's been asking when we'd all have dinner together again." I almost declined. Something in my gut told me to stay home. But Chloe and I had always been close, and I missed spending time with her. So on a chilly Friday evening, I drove across town and arrived at their house carrying a homemade apple pie. The moment I walked through the front door, I sensed something was off. Vanessa was unusually cheerful. Ethan seemed distracted, and Chloe barely touched her dinner. The atmosphere felt rehearsed, like everyone knew lines from a script except me. We sat around the dining table making small talk. For the first 20 minutes, everything appeared normal. School, work, the weather, the local football team. Then Vanessa set down her fork and smiled. The conversation shifted instantly. "Maxine," she began. That alone caught my attention. She almost always called me Mom. Not Maxine. Not unless she wanted emotional distance. I looked up. "Yes." She exchanged a quick glance with Ethan. Then she folded her hands neatly on the table. "We've been talking about your future." My stomach tightened. I glanced at Ethan. He avoided eye contact, the same way he had during our phone conversation. "What about my future?" I asked carefully. Vanessa's smile never moved. "We just think it's time to start considering safer living arrangements." There it was, out in the open. No more hints. No more suggestions. The words hung over the table like storm clouds. I set down my glass. "What exactly do you mean by safer living arrangements?" Vanessa immediately answered. "Assisted living." The room became silent. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly seemed louder. I looked directly at Ethan. "Ethan." He cleared his throat. "Mom, we're just worried." Worried. That word again. Always worried. Always concerned. Never specific. I forced myself to remain calm. "What are you worried about?" Neither of them answered immediately. Then Vanessa spoke. "You've been forgetting things." "No, I haven't." "You live alone?" "Yes." "You've had some confusion with medication." I stared at her. That accusation hit me like a slap. "No, I haven't." Vanessa tilted her head sympathetically. The gesture felt insulting. "Mom, sometimes people don't realize these things themselves." I felt heat rising in my chest. There is a particular kind of anger that comes when someone tries to convince you that your own reality isn't real. That's exactly what I felt. I turned toward Ethan again. "Do you believe this?" His silence lasted too long. Much too long. Finally, he sighed. "I think we should at least explore options." The words hurt more than anything Vanessa had said, because they came from my son, my own child, the boy I had raised, the boy who once promised he'd always protect me. I suddenly understood something. Vanessa wasn't acting alone anymore. She had convinced Ethan, or at least convinced him enough to doubt me. Vanessa pulled several glossy brochures from a folder beside her chair. She slid them across the table. The gesture immediately reminded me of the nursing home papers from the opening scene. Only this was the beginning. "These places are beautiful," she said. "Private rooms. Activities. Medical staff." I didn't touch the brochures. Instead, I looked around the table. That's when I noticed Chloe. My granddaughter looked miserable. Her eyes remained fixed on her plate. She hadn't spoken in nearly 10 minutes. "Chloe," I said softly. She looked up. "Do you think I need assisted living?" The question surprised everyone, especially Vanessa. For a brief moment, panic crossed her face. Then she quickly interrupted. "Sweetheart doesn't need to be involved in adult discussions." But Chloe kept looking at me, and in that moment I saw something I hadn't seen before. Fear. Not concern. Fear. The kind of fear someone carries when they're keeping a secret, or when they're afraid to tell the truth. Before Chloe could answer, Vanessa changed the subject. The conversation limped forward for another 20 minutes. I barely remember what anyone said. My thoughts were racing, trying to understand how things had reached this point. When dinner finally ended, I helped clear the dishes. Vanessa followed me into the kitchen. She lowered her voice. "You know we're only trying to help." I turned toward her. "Help with what?" She sighed dramatically. "Maxine, nobody wants to take away your independence." The statement sounded strange, because I hadn't mentioned independence. She had. People rarely defend themselves against accusations that haven't been made. I simply nodded and walked away. A few minutes later, I gathered my purse and prepared to leave. As I headed toward the front door, Chloe suddenly appeared beside me. Her movements were quick, nervous, deliberate. She wrapped her arms around me in a hug. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I felt something slide into my hand, a folded piece of paper, tiny, hidden, secret. I immediately understood. Without looking down, I slipped it into my coat pocket. When I stepped back, Chloe's eyes met mine. For just a second, the message was clear. Don't say anything. Don't react. Just leave. My heart began pounding. I hugged her again. Then I walked out the door. The drive home felt endless. Questions flooded my mind. What had Chloe given me? Why had she been so frightened? What was she trying to tell me? The moment I entered my house, I locked the door. I didn't even take off my coat. I went straight to the kitchen table. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. Inside was a single handwritten sentence. 3 words. Simple and terrifying. "Grandma, don't sign anything." I stared at the note, reading it again, and again, and again. The handwriting was unmistakably Chloe's. Suddenly, dozens of strange events crashed together inside my head. The brochures, the questions about my finances, the missing mail, the medication issues, the conversations about forgetfulness, the assisted living facilities, everything. A cold feeling settled in my stomach, because Chloe wasn't warning me about a nursing home. Not really. She was warning me about paperwork, documents, signatures, something legal, something important, something dangerous. I looked toward the hallway where framed photographs of my family lined the wall. One picture showed Ethan at age 10. Another showed Chloe as a little girl sitting on Robert's lap. For years, those photographs represented safety, family, trust. Now they felt different. Now they felt like evidence from a crime scene I didn't fully understand. I knew Chloe wouldn't risk angering her mother without a reason. She was a good kid, quiet, thoughtful, responsible. If she had slipped me that note in secret, something serious was happening, something she couldn't say out loud. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying the evening in my mind, every glance, every word, every expression, and by sunrise, I had made a decision. For weeks, I had been questioning my instincts, doubting myself, wondering if I was imagining things. Not anymore. The note changed everything, because for the first time, someone inside that house had confirmed my fears. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't confused. And I certainly wasn't imagining things. Someone was planning something that required my signature. And whatever it was, Chloe was terrified I might agree to it. The next morning, I started searching for answers. I had no idea that what I would eventually discover hidden among Vanessa's paperwork would be even worse than I imagined. Much worse. The note Chloe slipped into my hand changed everything. For weeks, I had been trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, That Vanessa's behavior was annoying, perhaps even inappropriate, but not malicious. The moment I read those 3 words, "Grandma, don't sign anything," that illusion disappeared. Someone wasn't just questioning my independence. Someone was preparing documents, and my granddaughter was frightened enough to warn me in secret. The following Monday, I decided to stop guessing and start investigating. One advantage of getting older is that people often underestimate you. They assume you're slower, less observant, less capable. Vanessa certainly did. What she didn't know was that before I retired, I spent more than 30 years working as a paralegal. I wasn't an attorney, but I spent decades reviewing contracts, legal filings, estate documents, and property records. I knew how paperwork could be used to protect people, and I knew how it could be used to take advantage of them. For most of my career, I worked for a small law firm in Columbus that specialized in estate planning and elder law. Ironically, I had spent years helping families prevent exactly the kind of situation I now found myself facing. That realization alone made me angry, not because I had been fooled, but because someone thought I could be. 3 days after receiving Chloe's note, an opportunity presented itself. Vanessa stopped by my house while I was trimming hedges. She mentioned needing to run errands. As she prepared to leave, she said something that immediately caught my attention. "Ethan forgot his laptop bag here last week. Mind if I grab it later?" "Of course." She smiled. "I'll let myself in." Then she drove away. The moment her car disappeared, I walked back into my house and sat at the kitchen table, thinking, if Vanessa planned to return while I was away, there was a reason. And suddenly I remembered something. 2 weeks earlier, I had seen her carrying a large accordion file folder, one she quickly tucked away when I entered the room. At the time, I ignored it. Now, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That afternoon, I drove to Ethan and Vanessa's house. I wasn't breaking in. I still had a key. They had given it to me years ago for emergencies. The entire drive, my conscience battled with my instincts. Part of me felt guilty. Another part felt desperate. If Chloe was right, I needed answers. When I arrived, the house was empty. I stepped inside. Quietly. The silence felt heavier than usual. I told myself I wasn't searching for secrets. I was searching for the truth. There is a difference. At least that's what I told myself. I started in the home office. Nothing unusual: bills, school paperwork, tax forms. Then I opened a filing cabinet drawer. Inside sat the accordion folder, the same one I remembered. My pulse quickened. For a moment, I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. The first few sections contained ordinary paperwork, insurance records, mortgage documents, household expenses. Then I found a tab labeled Family Planning. My stomach tightened. I opened it. The first document was titled Durable Power of Attorney. I froze. My name appeared on the first page. Maxine Price. The document designated Ethan as my legal representative. Several signature lines waited near the bottom. Unsigned. I turned the page. Another document. Medical Power of Attorney. Again. My name. Again. Blank signature spaces. Then another. Authorization for financial management. Another. Release of medical information. Another. Assisted living intake information. I felt my hands growing cold. There wasn't one document. There were dozens, carefully organized, prepared, waiting. All they needed was my signature. I sat down heavily in Ethan's desk chair, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I found something even worse. A property evaluation. My house. My home. The place Robert and I had spent decades building. Someone had requested an estimated market value. The report included photographs, recent sales comparisons, potential resale projections. This wasn't about helping me. This was about my property. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. I continued reading. Several pages later, I found handwritten notes. Vanessa's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. One sentence stood out. If Maxine agrees to assisted living house can be listed within 60 days. I stared at the words. Again. And again. And again. I could barely breathe, because suddenly every strange conversation made sense. The comments about forgetfulness, the discussions about safety, the questions about finances, the missing mail, the medical inquiries. They weren't isolated incidents. They were steps, pieces of a larger plan, a strategy. And that strategy depended on convincing everyone, including Ethan, that I could no longer manage my own affairs. I carefully photographed every document with my phone, every page, every note, every signature line. Years of legal experience had taught me one rule: never confront someone before preserving evidence. Once the photos were saved, I returned everything exactly where I found it. Then I drove home. The entire way I fought tears, not because of the documents, because of Ethan. I could understand Vanessa wanting money. Greed has existed forever. But Ethan, my son, had he helped create those documents? Did he know about them, or had Vanessa manipulated him too? I honestly didn't know which answer hurt more. That evening, I pulled out an old photo album. One picture showed Ethan at age 7 sitting on Robert's shoulders. Another showed us fishing together during a summer vacation. A third showed Ethan crying at Robert's funeral. Back then, we had promised each other we would always remain family. Always remain honest. Always protect one another. Looking at those photographs now felt like mourning someone who was still alive. Later that night, I found myself thinking about Robert, especially about something he once told me. It happened years before he died. We had attended a seminar about estate planning. On the drive home, Robert glanced at me and said something unusual. "Promise me something." "What?" "If anything ever happens to me, don't let anyone make you feel helpless." I laughed. "Why would I?" He grew serious. "Because people change when money is involved." I remember rolling my eyes. Robert wasn't usually cynical, but he insisted. "Promise me." So I did. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Now his words echoed in my head. Don't let anyone make you feel helpless. The next morning, I reviewed the photos again, this time with a professional eye. The documents themselves weren't illegal. Not yet. Power of attorney forms are common. Medical directives are common. Estate planning documents are common. The problem wasn't the paperwork. The problem was the context, the manipulation, the effort to convince people I needed them, the attempt to create a reality that didn't exist. Then I noticed something else. A name appeared repeatedly on several forms, someone I didn't recognize. Scott Reynolds. The same name appeared on consultation notes, planning summaries, care recommendations. Who was Scott Reynolds, and why did he seem connected to every major document I wrote the name down? A feeling deep inside told me he mattered. A lot. What I didn't know yet was that Scott Reynolds would soon walk directly into my life. And when he did, he would reveal just how desperate Vanessa had become. But by then, I was no longer the confused old woman she thought she could manipulate. I was paying attention, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I was preparing to fight back. After discovering the documents in Vanessa's file folder, I expected her to become more cautious. Instead, she became more aggressive. Looking back, I think she sensed time was running out. People who build plans around deception often become reckless when those plans start slipping away, and Vanessa was beginning to lose control. The change happened almost immediately. Her visits became more frequent. Her phone calls became more persistent. Her concern became impossible to escape. Every conversation somehow returned to the same topic: my future, my safety, my living situation. One Tuesday morning, she called before breakfast. "Mom, have you thought any more about assisted living?" "No." A pause. "You really should." "I'm doing just fine." "You may not realize how difficult things have become." I stared at the phone. There it was again. That same narrative. The one she had been building for months. The suggestion that I couldn't trust my own judgment. The implication that everyone else knew what was best for me, except me. I ended the conversation quickly, but the pressure continued. 3 days later, Ethan showed up unexpectedly. I was sitting on the porch drinking coffee when his truck pulled into the driveway. For a moment, I felt hopeful. Maybe he had finally realized something was wrong. Maybe he wanted to talk honestly. Maybe he missed his mother. Instead, he sat across from me with the same uncomfortable expression I had seen at dinner. The expression of a man repeating someone else's thoughts. "Mom," he began carefully, "Vanessa and I have been worried." I nearly laughed. There was that word again. Worried. Always worried. Never specific. Never honest. I folded my hands in my lap. "What exactly are you worried about?" Ethan looked away. "The house is getting harder for you to maintain." I glanced around. The lawn was trimmed. The garden was thriving. The porch had fresh paint. Nothing looked neglected. "What part seems difficult?" He hesitated, then changed direction. "You spend too much time alone." I almost smiled. When one argument failed, another appeared. "You know, Ethan," I said quietly, "people can live alone without being incapable." His shoulders tightened. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. By the end, I understood something painful. Ethan wasn't leading this campaign, but he had been influenced by it. Vanessa had spent months feeding him concerns, examples, stories, observations, little pieces of evidence, enough to create doubt. And doubt is powerful, especially when directed at someone you love. After he left, I sat on the porch for a long time, trying to decide what to do next. Then my phone rang. The caller ID showed Vanessa. Again, I almost ignored it. Almost. "Hello, Mom. I wanted to tell you something exciting." The cheerful tone immediately put me on guard. "What is it?" "We found someone who can help." My stomach tightened. "Help with what?" "Your transition." Transition. Not discussion. Not planning. Transition. As though the decision had already been made. Before I could respond, Vanessa continued, "He's wonderful." "Who?" "A family consultant." I said nothing. "He specializes in helping seniors make life changes." There was something rehearsed about her explanation. Something artificial. The call ended a few minutes later, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Family consultant. The phrase sounded impressive, professional, trustworthy. Yet something about it bothered me. The next week, I found out why. It was a Thursday afternoon when Vanessa arrived at my house. She wasn't alone. A tall man stepped out of the passenger side of her SUV, mid-50s, expensive suit, bright smile, perfect handshake, the kind of person who looked trustworthy because he had practiced looking trustworthy. Vanessa introduced him immediately. "Mom, this is Scott Reynolds." The name hit me like a warning siren. Scott Reynolds. The same name I had seen repeatedly in those documents. I kept my expression neutral. "Nice to meet you." Scott smiled warmly. "The pleasure is mine, Maxine." Something about hearing my first name from a stranger irritated me instantly. Vanessa acted as though this meeting had been planned. I knew better. No one had asked my permission. No one had even informed me beforehand. Yet here they were, standing on my porch, ready to discuss my future, inside my own home. I reluctantly invited them in. We sat in the living room. Scott immediately took control of the conversation. Not aggressively, professionally, which somehow felt worse. People trust professional confidence. That was clearly his specialty. He asked about my daily routines, my health, my social activities, my finances. The questions came one after another, smoothly, effortlessly, like an interview disguised as friendly conversation. Then he began making observations. "Many people your age struggle to recognize changes." I said nothing. Family members often notice problems first. Again, I remained silent. Transitioning early can prevent crises later. There it was, the agenda. Barely hidden, Scott wasn't evaluating me. He was selling something, the same way a real estate agent sells a house, or a salesman sells a car. For nearly 40 minutes he spoke, and the longer he talked, the more suspicious I became. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Because despite all his expertise, he never once discussed actual medical evaluations, never referenced physicians, never cited clinical findings. Everything was vague, general, subjective. Finally, I asked a simple question. "What are your credentials?" The room went quiet. Scott blinked. Just once. A tiny reaction. But I noticed. "I've worked with families for many years." "Doing what?" His smile weakened slightly. "Consulting." "Are you a doctor?" "No." "A psychologist?" "No." "A licensed social worker?" "No." The silence grew uncomfortable. Vanessa jumped in quickly. "Mom, credentials aren't everything." Actually, they are when someone is evaluating whether an older adult can live independently. The more Scott talked, the more certain I became. He wasn't a medical professional. He wasn't a mental health professional. He wasn't qualified to determine anything about my capacity. So why was he involved? That question haunted me. After they left, I began researching. A former paralegal learns one useful skill over time. Public records, business records, licensing databases. They all tell stories, sometimes better stories than people do. By evening, I had my answer. Scott Reynolds wasn't connected to healthcare. He wasn't connected to elder services. He wasn't connected to any senior advocacy organization. Instead, he was connected to a consulting company that frequently partnered with real estate investors and relocation services. I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. Real estate. There it was again. The same connection, the same pattern, the same destination. My house. The realization settled heavily in my chest. This wasn't happening because I needed help. This was happening because someone needed my property. And suddenly another disturbing thought entered my mind. Why were they moving so fast? For months, Vanessa had been laying groundwork. Now she was accelerating everything, pushing harder, applying more pressure, bringing outsiders into the situation. Why? What had changed? What deadline was approaching? Late that night, as I reviewed the photographs from Vanessa's documents again, I noticed something I had overlooked before. A handwritten note in the margin of one page. Only 6 words. Need signature before end of quarter. I stared at the sentence, then at the calendar, then back at the sentence. The end of the quarter was only weeks away. Whatever Vanessa was planning, she needed my signature quickly, desperately, and that meant she was running out of time. What I didn't know yet was exactly why she was so desperate, but very soon one phone call would reveal a secret she had been hiding from everyone, including Ethan, and that secret would change the entire battle. That night, after discovering the note about needing my signature before the end of the quarter, I couldn't sleep. The clock beside my bed read 1:17 a.m., then 2:43, then 4:06. Every time I closed my eyes, the same questions returned. Why was Vanessa in such a hurry? What was happening at the end of the quarter? And most importantly, who could help me uncover the truth? As dawn approached, I found myself standing in Robert's old study. The room looked almost exactly as he had left it. His favorite reading chair sat near the window. A framed photograph of our wedding day rested on the bookshelf. His old desk remained against the wall. I ran my fingers across the wood surface. For a moment, I could almost hear his voice. Whenever Robert faced a difficult decision, he always said the same thing. Talk to the people who know the facts. Not the opinions, not the emotions. The facts. Suddenly, I knew exactly who I needed to call. Daniel Brooks, Robert's attorney, our attorney. Daniel wasn't just a lawyer. He had been Robert's closest professional advisor for nearly 20 years. He handled our estate planning, our trust documents, our wills, everything. After Robert died, I hadn't spoken to Daniel very often. There hadn't been a reason. Now there was. At exactly 9 o'clock that morning, I picked up the phone. When his receptionist answered, I introduced myself. Less than 30 minutes later, Daniel was on the line. "Maxine," he said warmly. "It's been too long." Hearing a familiar voice nearly brought tears to my eyes. "I wish I were calling under better circumstances." His tone immediately changed. "What happened?" For nearly an hour, I told him everything. The comments about memory problems, the missing mail, the nursing home discussions, the documents, Scott Reynolds, the note from Chloe. Daniel listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, there was a long silence. The kind of silence lawyers make when they're thinking carefully. Then he asked a question. "Do you still have photographs of those documents?" "Yes." "Send everything to me." Within minutes, I emailed the files. The rest of the day felt endless. By evening, Daniel called back. His voice was noticeably different, more serious, more focused. "Maxine, I need to ask you something." "Of course." "Have you signed anything at all in the last year?" "No." "Nothing." "Nothing." He exhaled slowly. "Good." The single word immediately increased my anxiety. "What did you find?" Daniel paused. Then he asked another question. "Has Vanessa ever contacted me?" I frowned. "Not that I know of." "She contacted my office twice." I sat upright. "What?" "About 8 months ago." My stomach dropped. 8 months. Long before the nursing home discussions became public, long before Ethan started questioning my independence, long before any of this appeared obvious, this had been planned for a very long time. What did she want? Daniel's answer chilled me. She asked general questions about elder incapacity. I closed my eyes. The pieces were falling into place. Anything else? Yes. His voice became even more serious. She wanted to know what circumstances might allow family members to manage property on behalf of an elderly parent. I gripped the phone. Hard. What did you tell her? The truth. And what was that? Daniel didn't hesitate. That none of it mattered unless you were legally incapable of managing your own affairs. Relief washed through me. Briefly. Then another question appeared. If she knew that, why is she still pushing? Daniel was silent. Then he said something unexpected. Because she probably doesn't know everything. That got my attention. What do you mean? I heard papers moving on his desk. Then Daniel spoke words that changed everything. Robert was smarter than most people realized. A sad smile crossed my face. That's true. After his heart condition worsened, he became very concerned about protecting you. I remembered those conversations. Late nights at the kitchen table, estate planning meetings, stacks of paperwork. At the time, I hadn't paid much attention. I trusted Robert completely. Now I wished I had listened more carefully. Daniel continued. Several years before he died, Robert created a family trust. I frowned. I remember signing trust documents. Most people would assume the trust was created for inheritance purposes. Wasn't it? No. I felt my pulse quicken. Then why? Another pause. Then Daniel delivered the revelation. To protect you. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Daniel explained. The trust wasn't designed primarily to transfer assets after death. It was structured to protect the family home while I remained alive. Specifically me. Robert had anticipated a possibility I never considered, that someday someone might pressure me into transferring property, selling the house, giving away assets, or surrendering control. The trust created barriers against exactly that scenario. I sat speechless. Robert had been protecting me from beyond the grave. Daniel continued explaining. The house is held within the trust structure. I stared out the window, unable to speak. As long as you're mentally competent, nobody can force a sale. What about Ethan? No. What about Vanessa? Absolutely not. What if they obtain power of attorney? Not enough. I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real hope. The kind that comes when fear finally meets facts. Then Daniel revealed something else. Something even more shocking. I reviewed county property records after your call. My heart began racing again. And there have been inquiries. What kind of inquiries? Informal valuation requests. The same documents I had found, the same appraisals, the same property estimates. Someone had been actively investigating the potential sale value of my home. Long before discussing assisted living with me, long before expressing concern, long before pretending this was about safety. Daniel's voice hardened. Maxine, this was never about your health. Deep down, I already knew, but hearing someone else say it made the truth impossible to ignore. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had haunted me for weeks. Do you think Ethan knows? Daniel was careful. Very careful. As an attorney, I don't deal in assumptions. Not exactly an answer.
"What's your personal opinion?"
He sighed.
"I think someone has been feeding him information for a long time."
That matched my own suspicion. Ethan wasn't leading this effort. He was following it. Manipulated, influenced, conditioned. Still responsible, but perhaps not fully aware. Then Daniel said something unexpected.
"Maxine, I want to meet with you."
When?
"As soon as possible."
The urgency in his voice surprised me.
"Why?" "Because I believe this situation is moving faster than you realize."
My stomach tightened. What does that mean? He hesitated, then answered.
"It means if Vanessa is escalating, she may be under pressure."
The phrase immediately reminded me of the handwritten note. Needs signature before end of quarter. Pressure. Deadline. Urgency. It all connected. What kind of pressure? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. We arranged a meeting for the following morning. After hanging up, I sat quietly in Robert's study, looking at his photograph. For the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel helpless. I felt prepared. I had evidence. I had information. I had an attorney who understood exactly what was happening. Most importantly, I finally understood why my calm reaction at the beginning of this story mattered so much. Because when Vanessa slid those nursing home papers across my kitchen table, she thought she was dealing with a frightened old woman. What she didn't know was that the phone call I made had already awakened the one person capable of dismantling her entire plan. And before long, Daniel Brooks was going to uncover a secret that explained why Vanessa had become so desperate. A secret involving money. A lot of money. And when the truth emerged, even Ethan would struggle to believe it. The morning of the confrontation began with a text message from Vanessa. "Mom, we're coming by at 10 o'clock. Be ready. We found a wonderful place for you to tour." Not a question, not an invitation, a statement, a command. I stared at the message for several seconds before setting my phone down. The confidence in her words told me everything. Vanessa believed she had already won. She thought the paperwork was ready. She thought Ethan was on her side. She thought I was isolated. And most importantly, she thought I didn't know what she had been doing behind my back. For the first time in months, I felt calm. Not because the situation wasn't serious, because I was prepared. The previous afternoon, I had spent nearly 3 hours meeting with Daniel Brooks. He reviewed every photograph I had taken, every document, every note, every email trail he had uncovered. The deeper he investigated, the more troubling the picture became. And by the time we finished, he had already arranged for someone else to attend the meeting. A licensed social worker named Karen Mitchell. Unlike Scott Reynolds, Karen actually had credentials. Years of experience working with seniors, training in elder abuse cases, and absolutely no connection to Vanessa. Daniel wanted an independent professional present, someone whose opinion couldn't be manipulated. As for me, I simply waited. At 9:58 a.m., I looked out the front window and saw Vanessa's SUV pull into my driveway. My stomach tightened. Ethan stepped out first. He looked exhausted, as though he hadn't slept much. Vanessa emerged a second later carrying a thick folder. The sight immediately reminded me of the documents I'd found in her filing cabinet. Behind them stood Scott Reynolds, smiling, confident, certain. 3 people arriving to decide my future, without my permission. A few moments later, the doorbell rang. I opened the door. "Good morning," Vanessa said brightly. No one waited for an invitation. They simply walked inside. Scott shook my hand. Ethan gave me a brief hug, the kind of hug people give when they're avoiding guilt. Vanessa sat at the dining table and immediately opened her folder. The performance had begun. "We don't want to take too much of your time," she said. I almost laughed. The irony was unbelievable. For months, she had been taking control of my time, my reputation, and my independence. Now she was concerned about convenience. Scott leaned forward. "Maxine, we've identified an excellent assisted living community." The same rehearsed tone, the same artificial concern, the same assumptions. I remained silent. Vanessa interpreted my silence as weakness. That was her first mistake. "We've already scheduled a tour." Second mistake. "There are a few documents that would help streamline the process." Third mistake. She pulled papers from the folder, several signature tabs marked in bright yellow. Ready. Waiting. Prepared. Exactly as Chloe had warned. Don't sign anything. I looked at the stack, then at Vanessa, then at Ethan. "Have you read all of these?" I asked him. He hesitated. Not a good sign. Vanessa reviewed them. "In other words, no." I nodded slowly. Before anyone could continue, another knock sounded at the door. Vanessa frowned. Scott looked confused. Ethan glanced toward the entryway. I stood up. "I'll get it." When I opened the door, Daniel Brooks was standing there. Beside him stood Karen Mitchell, and behind them was a notary public carrying a briefcase. For a second, nobody spoke. Then Daniel smiled. "Good morning, Maxine." The reaction inside the house was immediate. Vanessa's face drained of color. Scott's confidence vanished. Ethan looked completely bewildered. "What is this?" Vanessa asked sharply. Daniel stepped inside. "My name is Daniel Brooks. I've represented the Price family for many years." Karen entered beside him. "And I'm Karen Mitchell, licensed social worker." The atmosphere changed instantly. The balance of power shifted. Vanessa knew it. I knew it. Even Ethan seemed to realize it. Daniel calmly placed a folder on the table. "Since we're discussing major life decisions today, I thought it might be helpful to review all relevant information." Vanessa forced a smile. "This is a family matter." "No," Daniel replied evenly. "It became a legal matter the moment documents involving property control and powers of attorney were prepared." Silence. Absolute silence. Ethan slowly turned toward Vanessa. "What does he mean?" She didn't answer. Scott attempted to intervene. "I think emotions are running high." Karen immediately responded. "No licensed assessment has determined that Maxine is incapable of independent living." Scott blinked. Karen continued. "In fact, after speaking with Maxine and reviewing available information, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment." The words hit the room like thunder. Vanessa crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous." Daniel opened his folder. "No, what's ridiculous is pretending concern while simultaneously researching property liquidation options." Vanessa's face froze. Ethan looked back and forth between them. "What property options?" Daniel calmly removed several pages, then placed them on the table. "Property valuation reports, copies of inquiries, records, dates, evidence, all neatly organized." Ethan picked up one page. His expression changed immediately. "What is this?" Daniel answered. "A market analysis of your mother's home." Ethan frowned. "Why would anyone request that?" No one spoke. Daniel let the silence do the work. Eventually, Ethan looked at Vanessa. The color left his face. "You requested this." Vanessa opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. No answer. That silence said everything. Daniel wasn't finished. He removed additional documents. Then came the emails. The room became so quiet I could hear the kitchen clock ticking. One email discussed property value projections. Another referenced transition planning. A third referenced assisted living timelines. Several included Scott Reynolds. One specifically mentioned selling the house after relocation. I watched Ethan reading. Each page seemed to age him another year. "Vanessa," he whispered. She immediately became defensive. "It's not what it looks like." The oldest excuse in the world, and usually the least believable. Daniel placed another document in front of him. "This email discusses listing the property within 60 days of relocation." Ethan's hands began trembling. Karen remained silent, allowing reality to speak for itself. Scott attempted to stand. "I don't think my presence is necessary." Daniel's response was immediate. "Actually, your presence is extremely interesting." Scott froze. Daniel opened another section of his file. "I spent some time researching your consulting business." The room went still. Daniel continued. "Your company has no healthcare licensing." No response. "No elder care certifications." Still nothing. "But it does maintain business relationships with multiple relocation and property service companies." Scott's jaw tightened. The mask was cracking. Fast. For months, I had felt powerless. For months, I had been doubted, questioned, manipulated. Now the truth was finally standing in the middle of the room where everyone could see it, including my son. Then Daniel delivered the final blow. "We're not finished." The words immediately captured everyone's attention. Because Daniel had discovered something else. Something far more serious than property inquiries. Something that explained why Vanessa had suddenly become desperate to obtain my signature before the end of the quarter. And when that information came out, it wouldn't just expose a scheme. It would expose a crisis. One that Vanessa had hidden from her own husband. One involving debt. Massive debt. The kind of debt capable of destroying an entire family. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the worst revelation was still waiting inside Daniel's folder, and within minutes his entire world was about to collapse. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Daniel mentioned Vanessa's hidden debt. The room felt frozen. Ethan stared at his wife. Vanessa stared at Daniel. Scott stared at the floor. And I sat quietly watching the truth finally begin to surface. For months, I had been treated like someone incapable of understanding reality. Now reality was sitting in front of everyone. Daniel opened another section of his file. His expression remained calm, professional, controlled, but I had known him long enough to recognize what was underneath. Anger. Not loud anger. The dangerous kind. The kind that appears when someone has spent decades watching people exploit others. "Vanessa," Daniel said evenly, "would you like to explain your financial situation before I do?" Her eyes widened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Daniel nodded, as though he had expected that answer. Then he removed several documents. Credit records, court filings, debt notices, payment demands. One by one, he placed them on the table. The sound of paper hitting wood seemed unusually loud. Ethan leaned forward, his face drained of color. "What is this?" Vanessa immediately reached for the documents. Daniel calmly moved them out of reach. "These records are public." The room became silent again. Karen sat quietly observing. Scott looked like he wanted to disappear. Then Daniel continued. "Over the last 2 years, Vanessa accumulated significant unsecured debt." Ethan blinked. "No." Daniel slid another document forward.
Credit cards.
Another.
Personal loans.
Another.
Investment losses.
Another.
Collection actions.
Each page seemed to strike Ethan like a physical blow. His breathing changed, his posture changed, everything changed.
Vanessa,
he whispered. She finally exploded.
You don't understand.
The sudden outburst startled everyone. For months she had maintained a perfect image. Calm, concerned, reasonable. Now the mask was cracking. Daniel remained composed.
Then explain.
Vanessa stood up abruptly.
I was trying to fix things.
What things? Ethan asked. She looked at him. For the first time, I saw genuine panic. Not anger, not arrogance. Fear. Real fear.
The investments failed.
Ethan stared.
What investments?
More silence. Then came the truth. The first layer of it anyway. Vanessa had secretly invested large amounts of money into a series of speculative real estate projects. Projects she believed would produce enormous returns. Instead, they collapsed. One after another. Losses multiplied. Credit cards filled. Loans increased. Interest accumulated. And rather than admitting the problem, she kept borrowing, trying to recover the losses, trying to outrun the consequences. Every decision made the situation worse. Daniel estimated the total debt at well over $200,000. The number hung in the air. Ethan looked physically ill.
You never told me.
Vanessa didn't answer, because there was no defense, no justification, no explanation. She had hidden everything. Then Karen spoke for the first time, quietly, carefully.
And when the debts became overwhelming,
Vanessa looked away. Nobody answered. Daniel did. That's when the planning accelerated. The room became silent again. Everyone understood exactly what he meant. The nursing home discussions, the powers of attorney, the property evaluations, the consultant, the pressure, the deadlines. They all began after the financial crisis, not before, because the goal had never been my safety. The goal had been my house. Ethan slowly lowered his head. I had never seen my son look so broken. Then another voice spoke, a small voice, from the hallway.
Grandma was never confused.
Everyone turned. Chloe stood near the doorway. I hadn't even realized she had arrived home from school. Tears filled her eyes. Vanessa immediately stiffened.
Chloe?
No. For the first time in her life, Chloe interrupted her mother. The room froze. The courage required for that moment must have been enormous. She stepped forward, looking directly at Ethan.
Dad, Grandma was never confused.
Nobody spoke.
I heard them.
Vanessa's face turned pale.
I heard Mom and Scott talking.
The silence became suffocating. Chloe continued. They said if Grandma signed the papers, everything would be easier. Ethan looked at his daughter, his hands trembling.
They said once she moved, the house could be sold.
The words shattered whatever remained of Vanessa's defense. I watched Ethan's expression change. Shock, pain, disbelief, then heartbreak. Because those weren't accusations from me, or Daniel, or Karen. They were coming from his own daughter. And Chloe had no reason to lie. Tears streamed down her face. I tried to tell somebody. My heart broke hearing those words. She had been carrying this burden alone. Listening, watching, knowing something was wrong. afraid nobody would believe her. Then she looked at me.
"I'm sorry, Grandma." I immediately stood and wrapped my arms around her. "You have nothing to apologize for." Her shoulders shook as she cried. I held her tightly, just as I had when she was little. For a moment the room disappeared. The conflict disappeared. The paperwork disappeared. All that remained was my granddaughter, a frightened young girl who had done the right thing. Eventually, Chloe stepped back. Daniel quietly handed Ethan another document. "What is this?" Ethan asked. "The trust summary." Ethan frowned. Daniel pointed to a section. "Your father created this years ago." Ethan began reading. Several seconds passed. Then his eyes widened. "What?" Daniel nodded. "The house cannot be sold through the process Vanessa planned." Vanessa looked up sharply. For the first time, genuine shock appeared on her face. She hadn't known. I immediately understood. All those months, all that manipulation, all those plans. And she never realized Robert had already protected the property. Daniel continued. "The trust structure prevents unauthorized sale, while Maxine remains competent." Ethan looked stunned. Vanessa looked horrified. Everything she had been working toward suddenly vanished, like smoke. The property wasn't available. The plan wouldn't work. The asset she wanted to access had been protected years ago by Robert, the man she thought she had outsmarted. A strange feeling settled over me. Part sadness, part relief, part admiration. Even after death, Robert had kept his promise. He protected me. Then Vanessa made one final attempt. She pointed directly at me. "This isn't fair." The room went silent. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. "Fair," Ethan repeated. She nodded desperately. "I was trying to save this family." The statement sounded hollow. Even she seemed to know it. Nobody believed it anymore. Not Daniel, not Karen, not Chloe, not Ethan, and certainly not me. The truth had become too obvious, too complete, too undeniable. For months, Vanessa had convinced people I was losing touch with reality. Now reality had exposed her instead. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I could see the ending approaching. But one final confrontation still remained, because Ethan hadn't made a decision yet. He now knew the truth. He knew about the debt, the manipulation, the lies, the plan involving my home. But knowledge and action are not the same thing. Soon he would face the most painful choice of his life. His wife, or the truth. And whatever decision he made would permanently change our family forever. After Chloe spoke, the room felt different. Not quieter, heavier. The truth had finally entered the room, and once truth arrives, lies have nowhere left to hide. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Vanessa stood beside the dining table, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists. Ethan sat motionless. The stack of documents remained scattered in front of him. Debt records, property evaluations, emails, notes, evidence. Months of deception compressed into a few inches of paper. I watched my son carefully. For most of this nightmare, I had focused on Vanessa. Her actions, her manipulation, her agenda. But now the focus shifted. The decision was no longer hers. It was Ethan's. And I wasn't sure which way he would go. For several long seconds, he stared at the tabletop. Then he finally looked up. At his wife. Not me. Not Daniel. Not Karen. His wife. "How long?" he asked quietly. Vanessa swallowed. What? How long have you been hiding this from me? The question hung in the air. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I remembered the months of lies, the attempts to portray me as mentally incapable, the plans involving my home, the manipulation of my son, the pressure placed on Chloe, and whatever sympathy I felt disappeared. Vanessa looked away. A while, Ethan repeated. His voice cracked. A while. The hurt in that single sentence was devastating, because it wasn't just about money, it was about trust, the foundation of every marriage, and that foundation was collapsing in front of him. I was trying to fix it, Vanessa whispered. You were trying to sell my mother's house. No. The denial came instantly. Too instantly. Daniel calmly slid another document toward Ethan. One of the emails. The email discussing the potential timeline for listing the property after my relocation. Ethan read it, then read it again. Slowly, carefully. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with disbelief. You discussed selling her house. Vanessa didn't answer, because she couldn't. The evidence was sitting directly in front of him. Karen finally spoke. Her voice remained calm and professional. Financial stress can cause people to make harmful decisions. Vanessa immediately seized on that statement. Exactly. She pointed toward Karen. That's what happened. But Karen wasn't finished. It can explain behavior. A pause. It doesn't excuse it. The room became silent again. I could see Vanessa realizing that nobody was coming to rescue her. Not Scott. Not Ethan. Not anyone. The narrative she'd carefully built for months was gone. Destroyed. Then she turned toward me, and for the first time the mask disappeared completely. All the warmth, all the concern, all the affection. Gone. What remained was resentment. Pure resentment. You think you're perfect, she snapped. The sudden hostility surprised no one. In many ways, it was overdue. I simply looked at her. I never claimed to be. Her voice rose. You've always judged me. No. Yes, you have. Again, I shook my head. The truth didn't require defending. Vanessa took a step forward. You made Ethan feel guilty every time we needed help. Ethan immediately looked up. What? She ignored him. You always acted like everything belonged to you. The accusation might have worked months earlier. Now it sounded desperate. Karen folded her arms. Daniel remained silent. Neither appeared impressed. I answered calmly. The money I gave you was freely offered. Vanessa laughed bitterly. You always kept score. That hurt. Not because it was true. Because it wasn't. I had never once asked to be repaid. Never once. Not for the down payment. Not for the tuition help. Not for the loans. Not for any of it. The truth was simple. I loved my family, and I wanted to help them succeed. Vanessa knew that, which made her accusation even sadder. Then Ethan spoke. Quietly. Dangerously quietly. Stop. Everyone turned. He was staring at Vanessa, not angrily, not yet, just exhausted. Stop blaming everyone else. The room froze. Vanessa looked stunned. Ethan? No. The word cut through the room. For the first time since this began, he sounded certain. You lied to me. She opened her mouth. He continued. You lied about the debt.
Silence.
You lied about the investments.
Silence.
You lied about Mom.
Silence. Each sentence landed harder than the one before it. I watched my son carefully, the boy I raised, the man who had doubted me, the man who had allowed himself to be manipulated. And for the first time in months, I saw him clearly, not as a victim, not as a villain, just a flawed human being facing an awful truth. Then Ethan turned toward Chloe. His daughter looked terrified.
Dad!
His expression softened immediately.
I'm sorry.
The apology surprised everyone, including Chloe. Tears filled her eyes.
You tried to tell us.
She nodded.
I didn't know what to do.
He stood and pulled her into a hug. Watching them nearly broke my heart, because beneath all the lies and manipulation there was still a family, damaged, bruised, but still there. Then Ethan released Chloe and turned back toward Vanessa. The room seemed to hold its breath. Everyone knew what was coming, even Vanessa.
Ethan,
she whispered. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, his decision had already been made.
I think you need to leave.
The words landed like a thunderclap. Vanessa stared at him.
What? You heard me?
Her face went white.
Ethan, don't do this.
His voice remained steady.
You need to leave.
The reality of the moment finally hit her. This wasn't another argument. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something she could talk her way out of. The consequences had arrived, and they were real. For several seconds, she simply stood there. Then her expression hardened. Fine. If sympathy wouldn't work, she would try intimidation. She pointed at Daniel.
This isn't over.
Daniel barely reacted.
I didn't think it was. I can fight this.
Daniel nodded.
You're entitled to legal counsel.
The calmness in his response seemed to infuriate her.
You think you have all the answers?
Daniel opened his folder one final time.
No.
He removed several additional documents.
But I have evidence.
Vanessa's confidence disappeared immediately. I recognized the look. She knew what was in those papers, and she knew exactly how damaging they were. Daniel's voice remained measured.
Attempting to obtain control of an elderly person's assets through deception can create serious legal consequences.
Nobody said the phrase elder financial abuse. He didn't need to. The implication was obvious. Vanessa's shoulders slumped. The fight left her, at least for the moment. Without another word, she grabbed her purse. Then she walked toward the door. Halfway there, she stopped. For one brief second, she looked back at the family she'd spent years building. Then she left. The front door closed behind her, and silence filled the house. A different kind of silence. Not the silence of secrets, the silence of aftermath. The silence that follows a storm. Nobody celebrated. Nobody smiled. Because victories like this rarely feel victorious. They feel sad, necessary, painful. Eventually, Daniel gathered his papers. Karen prepared to leave. The crisis was over, but the healing had not yet begun. As everyone slowly departed, Ethan remained seated at the table, alone, staring at the empty chair where Vanessa had been sitting. For the first time all day, he looked directly at me. His eyes were filled with regret, deep regret, the kind that cannot be erased with a simple apology. And in that moment, I realized the hardest part of this story wasn't exposing Vanessa. The hardest part was still ahead, because now my son would have to earn back something far more valuable than money, my trust.
People often think healing begins the moment the truth comes out. It doesn't. The truth ends the deception. Healing is something entirely different. Healing takes time. And trust once broken rarely returns all at once. The weeks after Vanessa left were some of the strangest of my life. For months, I had been fighting a battle I couldn't fully see. Now the battle was over. The house was quiet again. No more surprise visits. No more conversations about assisted living. No more subtle suggestions that I was losing my mind. No more pressure. No more manipulation. Just silence. At first, the silence felt wonderful. Then it felt lonely. Not because I missed Vanessa. I didn't. What I missed was the family I thought I had. The family I believed existed before everything fell apart. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the confrontation, Ethan came to visit. Alone. I saw his truck pull into the driveway from my kitchen window. For a moment, I considered pretending not to be home. Instead, I opened the door before he could knock. He looked tired. Older somehow. As though the last few weeks had aged him years. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, Ethan." The conversation felt awkward immediately. Neither of us knew where to begin. Eventually, we sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Robert and I had shared countless meals. The same table where I had paid bills, planned holidays, and helped Chloe with homework. The same table where I had once believed my family was safe. For several minutes, Ethan stared at his hands. Then he spoke. "I'm sorry." The words were simple, sincere, painful. I had waited a long time to hear them, yet they didn't erase what happened. Nothing could. "I know," I said quietly. His eyes filled with tears. "I should have listened." I didn't respond, because he was right. He should have listened. Not only to me, to his instincts, to Chloe, to the warning signs that had been present for months. "I failed you." The statement hurt because it was true, but I could also see how much it hurt him to say it. People often imagine forgiveness as a single moment, a decision, a switch that flips. Real forgiveness doesn't work that way, especially when trust is involved. "I love you, Ethan." His head lifted. "But I can't pretend none of this happened." The tears finally escaped. He nodded. Slowly, painfully. "I understand." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I believed he actually did. The conversation lasted nearly 3 hours, longer than any conversation we'd had in years. We talked about Robert, about grief, about loneliness, about how easy it can be to ignore uncomfortable truths when they're coming from someone you love. Ethan admitted that Vanessa had been planting doubts for a long time. Small comments, tiny concerns, constant repetition. By the time she suggested assisted living, he had already heard hundreds of warnings, most of them false, but repeated often enough to sound believable. "I thought I was helping." I looked at him carefully. "I know." And strangely enough, I did. That didn't excuse his choices. But understanding isn't the same thing as excusing. As the weeks passed, Ethan continued showing up, not demanding forgiveness, not asking for sympathy, simply showing up. Helping with yard work, fixing a broken gate, replacing a damaged porch light. Small things, consistent things, the kind of things trust is rebuilt from, one action at a time. Meanwhile, Vanessa moved into an apartment across town. Daniel later informed me that several financial investigations were underway. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal at that point,
but enough to create consequences, enough to force accountability, enough to ensure she couldn't simply move on and repeat the same behavior elsewhere. Oddly enough, I felt no satisfaction hearing that, just sadness. Years earlier, I genuinely loved Vanessa. I wanted her to succeed. I wanted her to be happy. I wanted her to become part of our family. Somewhere along the way, greed and desperation took control, and everyone paid the price, especially Chloe. Out of everyone involved, she was the one I worried about most. Children often become invisible casualties in adult conflicts. People forget they're watching, listening, absorbing everything. A month after the confrontation, Chloe asked if she could spend a few weeks with me. The request surprised me, but not as much as her explanation. "I feel safe here." Those 4 words nearly broke my heart. Of course she could stay. For the rest of the summer, my house felt alive again. We baked cookies, watched old movies, worked in the garden, talked for hours, sometimes about serious things, sometimes about nothing at all. One evening, we sat on the back porch watching fireflies dance across the yard, the same yard Robert and I had dreamed about decades earlier. "Grandma." "Yes." "I'm glad you didn't give up." I smiled. "Neither am I." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and for the first time in a very long while, everything felt peaceful. Not perfect. Peaceful. There is a difference. As autumn arrived, life slowly settled into a new rhythm. The garden changed colors. The leaves began falling. The air turned cooler. One afternoon, I found myself standing in front of Robert's photograph in the living room, the same photograph I had looked at during my darkest moments. I smiled. Not because everything turned out perfectly, because it didn't. Families are complicated. Relationships leave scars. Some wounds heal slowly. Others never fully disappear. But I had survived. I still had my home. I still had my independence. I still had my dignity. Most importantly, I still had the ability to make my own choices. No one had taken that from me, and no one ever would. As I looked around the house, I realized something important. Growing older does not make us weak. Needing help does not make us powerless. And age should never be used as an excuse to silence someone's voice. Far too many older people are treated as though their opinions matter less, as though their lives belong to others, as though experience disappears with age. That isn't true. Not for me. Not for anyone. The day Vanessa placed those nursing home papers in front of me, she believed she was dealing with a helpless old woman. What she discovered instead was something very different. A woman who remembered exactly who she was. A woman protected by the wisdom of her late husband. A woman supported by the courage of her granddaughter. And a woman willing to fight for her own future. In the end, I kept the house Robert and I built together. But more than that, I kept something far more valuable. My self-respect. And that's something no one can ever take away. Life has taught me that the people closest to us can sometimes hurt us the most. But it has also taught me that truth has a way of finding the light no matter how carefully someone tries to hide it. If there is one lesson in my story, it is this. Growing older does not mean surrendering your voice. Age does not erase wisdom. It does not erase dignity. And it certainly does not give anyone the right to make decisions for you without your consent. Family should be built on trust, not control. Love should never require manipulation, pressure, or hidden paperwork. And when someone asks you to sign something you do not fully understand, take your time. Ask questions. Seek advice. Protect yourself. I also learned that silence can be dangerous. Ethan stayed silent when he should have asked harder questions. Chloe stayed silent because she was afraid. I stayed silent because I wanted to believe the best about the people I loved. The moment we started speaking honestly, everything changed. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted? What would you have done if you were in my position? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. I always enjoy reading your stories. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe, and join our community for more powerful family stories. Thank you for spending your time with me today.